Hi everyone, welcome to A Taste of Tomorrow. Fake meat, sautéed spider and lobster lollies. Wow, sounds like a five-star cuisine. Really? My name is Tony Bassick. I'm the director of the La Trobe Institute for Agriculture and Food, and it is my pleasure to introduce this webinar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of La Trobe University, the traditional custodians of the lands where its campuses are located in Victoria. We recognise that Indigenous Australians have an ongoing connection to the land, and the university values their unique contribution to the university and the wider community, and indeed to our food supply. How we will feed the growing population, estimated to reach 10 billion by 2050. That is a whopping increase of 25% in the next 30 years, but requiring 70% more calories. And how we do this with sustainable and nutritious foods is an extremely important issue for all Australians, and indeed for our planet, particularly as we try to reduce the impact of human activities on the environment and promote healthy diets as a preventative medicine for human health. Today you will hear from research experts in agriculture, nutrition, ecology and psychology about approaches to do just that. The COVID-19 pandemic, which is undoubtedly a global crisis, has exposed the fragility of global food supplies, the national importance of food security, and a strong manufacturing base to value add to our largely commodity-based agri-food sector. This crisis has jolted our thinking on many fronts. And as we emerge out of this crisis, which undoubtedly we will, do we revert to the status quo or dare to do things differently and grasp a unique opportunity for Australia's agri-food sector to position itself as the provider of choice of clean, safe and nutritious premium quality foods? This webinar, A Taste of Tomorrow, is indeed prescient. More than 2 in 5 consumers are spending more time cooking and preparing food at home. I know I am. Instead of getting takeaway food and going out, consumers are experimenting with recipes as they spend more time at home. The domestic export and import markets have changed dramatically this year as our supply chains that are based upon a philosophy of on-demand need have been found inadequate. And so it's the realisation that we need to challenge ourselves to think differently about what we eat, how we produce food, and our consumption, and the ways that we do that which can be sustainable and viable in the long term. Two things are certain in these very uncertain times. Firstly, business as usual is not an option. And secondly, we need a highly skilled workforce to help solve these challenges into the future, and that is you. Nature offers many solutions, some of which we'll explore today. Plants. There are approximately 400,000 plant species on the planet, of which approximately 7,000 have been cultivated for food. And interestingly, another 20,000 are used as sources of medicine. Some 40% of our pharmaceuticals are either extracted from plants or plant-derived. But of these plants that are used for food, only 30 of the 400,000 species provide 95% of our food and energy. Let's mine this diversity. Today, we'll hear about the opportunities offered by pulses, legumes, as alternate protein sources to meat, and plants that grow in the oceans and waterways, algae. We'll also hear about insects. Now, there's more than 1 million or perhaps 10 million species. And as you'll hear, another inspired source of alternate protein with a significantly lower footprint on our resources. Scientists working in labs or doing field work around the nation will play an important role in providing the solutions, especially the fantastic scientists we have at La Trobe and the ones you will hear from today. Whether we realise it or not, science is part of everyone's life, and all of us are taking part in science in our own kitchens. Scientists solve problems, often in teams, often and sometimes serendipitously, and sometimes the right answer depends on context and interpretation. Our event today will begin with a scenario, and Dr. David Hoxley will take you through that shortly. Each member of the panel will be assigned a character to play and will improvise responses when invited by the facilitator. Before introducing the panel, I'd like to also acknowledge our sponsors. We would like to thank the Australian Government for funding our National Science Week events and support from Inspiring Victoria and La Trobe University. So, our panel today, the researchers, Dr. Kim Johnson. Kim is a project leader and she's the inspiration and drive behind A Taste of Tomorrow. She's a senior research fellow in the La Trobe Institute for Agriculture and Food. Her research involves understanding how plants adapt to physical stress so that we can make plants more productive and resilient. Susan McLeod. Susan is a lecturer in the Department of Dietetics, Nutrition and Sport, teaching nutrition and food science. And she's also undertaking a PhD looking at the link between our gut bacteria and mental health. Dr. Monica Doblin. Monica is a senior research fellow in the La Trobe Institute for Agriculture and Food. Monica's research investigates how the structural parts of plants contribute to dietary fibre and the importance of dietary fibre to nutrition. Associate Professor Martin Steinbau. Martin is an associate professor at La Trobe University within the Department of Ecology, Environment and Evolution. Martin's research investigates insect-plant interactions. Dr. Marissa Collins. Marissa is a senior lecturer of agronomy in the School of Animal, Plant and Soil Sciences at La Trobe University. Marissa works as a crop physiologist, where she investigates crop responses to drought and heat stress and improving water productivity. And the soil is a critical part of this work. Dr. Matthew Ruby. Matthew is a lecturer in the School of Psychology and Public Health at La Trobe University, Albury-Wodonga campus. Matthew research centres on the conflict between people's desire for meat and the costs of indulging this desire. Last but not least is our MC, who I will now hand over to you, Dr. David Hoxley, to introduce and lead this fun discussion about the future. David is a senior lecturer and researcher in condensed matter physics at La Trobe University, and he focuses on quantum electronics in diamonds. I don't think we'll find too many in food, but he's going to tell us that link shortly. Last year, he ran the Science Week events, Coffee and Space. I hope you enjoy this session and many of the other activities coming up as part of what is a fantastic National Science Week. So welcome, and over to David.
Thank you very, very much, Tony Burchich. So yes, I'm a physicist, so I'm the MC and slightly odd man out, might argue, very odd. I noticed people are raising hands via Zoom, which is fantastic. Everybody pile into the Q&A. We're going to take as many of your questions as we can at the end. We've got a lot of time set aside for it, and we really, really love your questions. In fact, sometimes the Q&A is the best part of what we're doing, and all these guys love it as well. So I'd like you to play a game with us and imagine that it is 2021. President Joe Biden lies in state. He is unfortunately as dead as a doornail. He's been felled by a mystery virus that came out of New Zealand. Somehow this virus jumped the species barrier from sheep to people. No one quite knows how, but it turns out this virus is terribly, terribly reminiscent of the great coronavirus pandemic of 2020. And yet this virus has a particular twist. It targets the malnourished. The world is in crisis. Now President Kamala Harris convenes an emergency committee, decides that the World Health Organization does have a use after all, and appoints her special envoy, Troye Sivan, to try and create a fast-moving team to address this solution. To the president and Troye's astonishment, malnourishment that is leading to people to die is as prevalent in Kentucky in the United States as it is in places like India and North Korea. And people are dying in droves. Something must be done. Answers must be found. So Troye rings up his mate, Susan McLeod, who he met at the Global Table Shindig in Melbourne way back in 2019, and says, Susan, what's going on? How could the richest country in the world, with all of the aircraft carriers and all of the bling in Hollywood, how can it have malnourished citizens?
That's an excellent question. So most people think that malnutrition is related to undernutrition, but in fact, malnutrition refers to deficiencies, excesses, and imbalances in a person's energy intake. So malnutrition is undernutrition. It's also deficiencies in micronutrients, and it's to do with overweight and obesity. And if we look at the current obesity rates in Kentucky, they're sitting at around 37%. So this result is not surprising at all.
Okay, that's very, very interesting and very frightening that not even the rich are safe. So Troy quickly looks for the first solution he can think of and suggests that you stuff people full of vitamin pills. Susan, is this going to work?
Well, vitamins have a place in our society, but they're not really the answer to everything. I think that the best option is fresh food. When you start processing foods to make vitamins or any form of processing, there's the potential to destroy the vitamins and minerals that naturally exist in these foods. So my philosophy is fresh is best.
Okay, this is not what Troy wants to hear, because when you're trying to ship fresh food around the place, it's expensive. You need a cold chain, things get wasted, it costs money. He decides to go to the people. Everybody out there, you are the people. We're now going to conduct a poll. So please vote. Your answers may determine the trajectory of this role play. And the answers are coming in thick and fast. That's great to see. Oh, fresh food got in there quickly, but supplements are making a good comeback. Oh, almost everyone's voted. Let's see if we can get it to 95%, 90%. I think that the results are absolutely overwhelming. We have 87% of people reckon that fresh food is the way to go. Okay. So fresh food is shipped to the people of Kentucky by the truckload. And Gwyneth Paltrow turns up, selling her magnificent blonde, fashion-matching NutriBullet clone to make the special product Goop Juice. The Kentuckians love this and take to it in droves. And everyone's taking their fresh fruit and vegetables, putting them into the Goop Bullet and making Goop Juice and drinking that and saying, work done, back to television. This seems not to be solving the problem. The virus is still making merry hell with the lives of the Kentuckians, even though they're drinking all of this Goop Juice. Troy turns around to Susan and says, Susan, I thought you said this was going to solve the problem.
So juices are fantastic, but the problem with them is that when we juice our fruits and vegetables, we're removing all that wonderful fibre, and we need fibre to keep our digestive system healthy. So while this is one option to with what you can do with fruit and vegetable, it's really not the best choice. So they maybe need to be looking at consuming fruit and vegetables whole, but also including other forms of dietary fibre and ingredients in their diet. So things like cereals are excellent forms of dietary fibre as well. So perhaps we need to include a few more things in our diet, not just fruit and veg, and certainly not the processed kind.
So Kamala Harris has got a headache and looks at Troy and says, all right, you're telling me that the processing of food is a problem here. And yet we process food and have done for ages. Can you please find me someone who can explain this to me in words of one syllable or less? Luckily, Troy happens to have Monica on speed dial. Monica Doblin.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate that you crossed to me and consider that, yeah, fibre is actually going to be really important in solving this critical issue. So we actually do process quite a few foods, particularly cereal grains, where we take the outer husk away because it's really unpalatable. But what we also do is we also remove the outer layer of the grain, which contains all the micronutrients that are contained in that particular tissue. And when we make flour, and particularly white flour from wheat, we actually remove the fibre as well. So it's a real problem. So as Susan said, we should definitely be eating whole grains as a means to increase our fibre content. And that seems a simple solution, doesn't it, to this problem?
The President is impressed, Monica, at your nimble grasp of the issue, but has a question for you. Why do we process grain in the first place? If whole grains are so much better, what's the advantage? Why do we throw part of it away?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in that outer layer of the grain also is a high amount of fats. And those fats go rancid quite quickly. And that's the reason why, in fact, in Asian countries, they tend to pearl brown rice to white, because it has a longer storage, has greater shelf life. So it stores for longer. So that's the reason why historically it's been processed in that way. But now in our global society, we can really make do with processing grain less. And so we're retaining some of that really nutritious outer layer to the grain. The soluble fibre too, that's inside the grain, is also really important. So in processing, we can remove some of that. And actually in wheat, which is one of our biggest cereal crops, we actually don't have a lot of soluble fibre. Soluble fibre is in fact critical for diet-related or reducing diet-related diseases. So things like obesity and type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, cardiovascular disease are all impacted by soluble dietary fibre. So if we eat that in other grains such as oats and barley, we can really do ourselves a favour and have a preventative health benefit, which will obviously help us with fighting this awful virus.
Thanks, Monica. So Troy, unbeknownst to anyone else, actually happens to have shares in the Goop Juice enterprise, and he's looking for a quick fix so that he can make sure he can afford all of the Lamborghinis for 2022. And he realizes that most animals that we eat are fed grain. And he thinks, why can't we just divert all of the grain that we feed to the animals and divert it to the people of Kentucky, and they can still have their Goop Juice with the soluble fibre? Problem solved, right?
Well, yes and no. So we know that when we grow these large monocultures of plants, so if anyone's ever been into the Midwest of the US, literally for miles and miles, all you see are these cornfields. But what can happen, of course, is that they're more susceptible to things like disease outbreaks. And so you can quickly imagine that that might be a big problem when we've got only a few crops that we sort of rely on. The other thing that happens, of course, when we intensively farm is we take out the nutrients from the soil, which also can impact disease. So we tend to get more disease loads under those conditions. So we really do need to be looking at things like legumes, which actually actively put nutrients back into the soil because they can actually fix their own nitrogen. Wow, how good's that?
Troy is confused by the word legumes. He's thinking that it's something like pulling the legs off flies, which he used to do when he was a kid back in Australia. Is he talking about legs of insects? What's a legume?
Well, I think it's definitely a type of plant that uses bacteria to fix nitrogen, and it's a beneficial relationship between the bacterium and the plant. So the plant provides shelter and housing and other nutrients to the bacterium, and the bacterium helps to fix nitrogen, and that's put into the soil and helps increase plant productivity. That also has benefits because we have to use less fertilizer in those sort of cases. So it's a win-win.
That sounds great. What are some examples of legumes that Troy might be familiar with from his childhood in Australia?
Well, there's quite a few that we grow in Australia. I think Marissa's the expert, but I will have a go. There are chickpeas and lentils, faba beans, all sorts of beans, I suppose, and pulses is another name for legumes that people may have heard.
That's most excellent. So Troy takes this back to Kamala Harris, and Kamala is thinking, I can see a problem here. If we're going to force the residents of Kentucky to eat these freak bacteria-laden superfoods, they might not vote me back into office, and that's an issue. So I need my Lamborghinis too. She rings up her mate ScoMo from Canberra. They went to a conference together and they were doing their MBAs, and asks ScoMo if he can run a quiet little focus group on a whole bunch of Australian school students, because she's really concerned about the youth vote in the United States. So our audience, you are now a focus group, and here is your poll. First of all, we want to find out, have you tried any of these legumes? You want to find out what you're familiar with and what you've never heard of. Now, while we're waiting for the poll results to come in, this is the moment that many of you have been waiting for. You might have a box, a Taste Tomorrow box, a little cardboard missile of tasty goodness that, of course, you haven't opened yet, and you don't know what's inside it, but you're desperate to find out. Don't open it just yet. Just pull it out from wherever you've got it. If you're in a classroom and your teacher's the one who's got it, make sure the teacher's got it where you can see it, because the teacher's going to have to do something with it special in a minute. Yes, teachers, we're talking to you. And when this poll's come in, we'll have our first opening of the box and our first tasting. So we've got 80% of people voting. Let's see if we can get it to 90%. Click the subscribe button below and turn it blue. Interestingly, we have 23% of the respondents have eaten chocolate-covered chickpeas, which I have never heard of in my life, and now I really want some. I know about chocolate-covered coffee beans, but they're fantastic. All right, so most people have had lentil pasta, chickpea flour. A lot of people have had mung beans. Not so many people have had aquafaba. Now, aquafaba is a pretty amazing thing, and we might come back to that later. All right, folks, get your box out. If any of our poll participants on the Brady Bunch squares in front of us have got them, pull out your box. And what we want you to do is to eat the chickpeas. Get the chickpeas and eat them. And don't let your teachers eat all the chickpeas. Their role will come in a minute. Now, while everybody's got the boxes open and they're eating the chickpeas, what we found is that the focus group was rerun in Kentucky and the results were vastly, vastly different. In fact, none of the people in Kentucky, to within 1%, had even heard of any of these options, much less experimented with them. There is a problem in the polling. Troy calls up his very old friend, I shouldn't say very old, his friend from a long time ago, Marissa Collins. I'm going to pay for that later. Marissa, can you explain why it is that Australian school students are so far ahead of the curve compared to Kentucky school students?
Well, David, we're really lucky in Australia in that for quite a long time, and even back to your childhood and the basics, we've had pulse products in our supermarkets being relatively common. So a classic example that's been really popular in Australia for a very long time is baked beans. So when we talk about legume and pulse crops, it's generally bean and pea products. And so, you know, the long-term example is baked beans, but now you can go into the canned vegetable aisle and you can find a really broad assortment of beans. So it's really common to see cannelloni beans and broad beans and kidney beans, as well as if you go into the soup section, you'll find a variety of different types of dried lentils, red and yellow and green lentils. It's also common to be able to pick up dried chickpeas. And then when you go into the snack aisles, there's plenty of products now in the snack aisles made from faba beans and chickpeas and lentils. So we're really spoilt for choice in Australia. And our farmers also are really high level producers of pulse products as well. So we've just had much more exposure over here.
So Troy is very fond of Marissa, but doesn't entirely believe her. So he decides to go draw some peer review, gets Susan on the blower and says, Susan, is Marissa selling us the real deal, or is this just kind of, is she in the pocket of the chickpea manufacturers?
Marissa is absolutely selling the real deal. Chickpeas are amazing. So chickpeas are around 2 times higher in protein than most other legumes, and they're high in fibre, and they're packed with other nutrients. So they're definitely worth considering as part of your regular diet.
Excellent. Okay, Troy sold, talks to Kamala. Kamala's decided that Australia contains the future, and there's an opportunity here. Decides that Australia should in fact supply the entire world, starting with Kentucky, with legumes. And Marissa is given the job of answering the question, can Australia supply the world with legumes? A big, brown, arid land a million miles from everybody else.
So one thing that Australia can do in addition to the US, so one thing that's worth noting to start is that America produces one particular type of pulse crop, which is soybeans, in enormous numbers already. So what we want to do is we don't need to supply the entire market, but we really want to add some of that diversity that we talked about previously, having that diverse range of crops and the diverse range of nutrients in the different type of pulse crops. Australia is excellent at growing chickpeas, and we're also fantastic at growing lentils and field peas and a few other crops. One of the things we need to do though is really do some research around the areas of understanding pulse physiology, so how pulse crops interact with the environment, what kind of risks are there about growing pulses in association with frost and heat stress and drought stress. And we really need to characterise that for the different regions. So we can say to farmers, if you are going to increase your pulse productivity by 300% so we can meet this demand, you need to make sure you hit these sowing windows so your pulse crops are as happy as possible for most of the season. And so then without enormously increasing the amount of land we need to produce these crops, we can hugely bump up our productivity. And the benefits of farmers increasing the number of pulses in their rotations is that they fix their own nitrogen, so you get a soil fertilisation benefit, but it also gives you that diversity of crops that helps mean that when you do grow your wheat crops, you don't get big disease outbreaks. So there's a lot of positives for Australia being able to supply the US with their entire or a diverse section of their pulse requirements.
The decision is made in the White House. The Pulse Institute is created in Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory. And Marissa, you are given a chance to create a hand-picked team of researchers on an almost infinite American military-style budget channeled through the World Health Organization. So the world looks with anticipation to see what sort of interesting crops you can create, possibly using genetic engineering, although we might come back to that later. So tons of chickpeas and beans have been delivered to Kentucky, to the slight horror of the chicken friars who live there. Susan McLeod, you're on the ground, you're in the helicopters flying over these mass warehouses filled with tins of chickpeas from Australia. You can see the queues of the desperate, half-starved zombies who are wearing their special virus-proof face masks, who are trying desperately to be the survivors, and the corpses are littering the streets. These people are not well, Susan. If they just eat the chickpeas, is that going to fix everything?
No, it's not. So when we eat chickpeas or legumes, we're getting amino acids in our diet. So they have a form of protein, and proteins are made up of amino acids. And there are some that are essential in our diet. So we can make some ourselves, but some have to come from our diet. When we eat legumes, there are a couple of those amino acids that are missing. And so we need to have something else that will give us that. And an excellent complementary protein to that is grains. So what is missing in legumes is actually available in grains, and what's missing in grains is available in legumes. So if we were to eat those two things together, then we would actually get all of the amino acids that we need.
So Troy hears you because he's in the helicopter next to you. And on the other side of you is one of Troy's mentors, Snoop Dogg, who suggests that maybe one of the ways forward could be to use his favorite crop, hemp. Kamala Harris is cringing slightly over the Telecaster as she sees this conversation unfold, but Snoop is really trying to sell the idea that hemp is this complete protein. Susan, is hemp a complete protein?
Hemp is a complete protein. It's actually an absolutely fantastic food selection. However, we're going to have a problem if we're trying to make hemp buns with it, because the hemp grain doesn't contain any gluten, and we need gluten to provide that structure when we're baking. So while hemp is an excellent food and it's a complete protein, it's got lots of essential fats in it and vitamins and minerals, it's not necessarily our best choice when it comes to providing gluten to make bread. However, there might be something we could do about that.
Okay, so Snoop Dogg gives you a very nice smile, backing him up, but President Harris is still not convinced and wants Monica Doblin to find out whether Susan's taking something. I think you're muted, Monica.
Apologies. Susan's right on the money. Hemp or the seed of hemp is a very nutritious source of proteins and essential fats and vitamins and minerals. The other thing it doesn't have is all of the psychoactive components that I think you're alluding to, David. That those compounds, those secondary metabolites, aren't found in high doses in the seed, so it's perfectly safe to eat.
Excellent. Okay, so two of the leading scientists at La Trobe, which is one of the leading areas in the world now, thanks to the Pulse Institute's disbursement of funding, have agreed that hemp is the way to go. But there are some issues with gluten. It occurs to Susan and Monica and Snoop and Troy all in one moment that they could genetically engineer this crop. They've heard about that because they saw a presentation given by Dr. Kim Johnson on genetically engineering grains and grasses. So they get her on Zoom and they say, Kimbo, tell us all about how we can make a frankenhemp that we can turn into bread.
Well, David, hemp is amazing, as Susan and Monica have already pointed out. So it has a lot of advantages over wheat in terms of you can use the whole crop, you can use the stems, you can use the seeds, you can use the flowers for medicine, but it does not contain gluten. So you would have to add this by some way, and genetic modification is one such way potentially. But there's been a bit of controversy about whether or not people would accept GM food. So that's something I'd really like to ask people at home.
Okay, so the turntables, and now we need to find out if the public would eat this frankenhemp. Would you eat a plant or an animal that had been gene edited? Kim, is gene edited the same as genetically modified? Is that the same thing?
There is a subtle difference here. So people might have started to hear about something called gene editing or CRISPR-Cas. So this is where you make very specific small changes to the genetic material of a plant or an animal. And it can be very, very specific and very accurate. And it's a very small change, which is really similar to what can happen naturally. So we all know we're a little bit different, and we're a little bit different because we have these small changes in our genes. And that's what gene editing can do. It can mimic this similar process. Genetic modification is a sort of broader term. that could include adding something back in that isn't there. In the case of hemp, that's what we'd have to do because it doesn't have these genes that can make gluten. So we would have to add something back in. Now there is a small, I'm just going to see how we're going with the polling just in case. We're looking pretty split here, David, but we've got a few more people to come in. If people just want to put their last in.
Can we frame this discussion in a different way? Because I know that with genetic modification, there's very strongly held positions on both sides. And I have heard in the front bar of the pub that I go to, people say, we've been genetically modifying for thousands of years by selectively breeding wheat, yada, yada, yada. And then other people say, yeah, but thousands of years is not overnight. And it goes backwards and forwards and punches fly. So what's your interpretation to this barroom brawl?
We have been genetically modifying plants and animals for thousands of years. That's why we have the foods we have. If we tried to eat what our hunter-gatherer friends grew up thousands of years ago, we wouldn't be able to have, we wouldn't have enough food. So we know that the plants and animals we have today have been improved, have been generated, you know, for years and years and years to improve their properties, to increase the amount they can produce. We have genetically modified many, many, many years. But this is just another tool. It's another technique to do that. And it's faster than traditional breeding where you have to cross and wait for the next generation and then the next generation and get rid of other background mutations that you may not want to bring along with you. So to me, I see this as just another technique and it's one of many. So we have a lot of other sort of genetic tools now that we can use, and this is things like sequencing the genomes and finding these specific characteristics that we want.
David, perhaps we should ask the students another question. Would they take a drug that's administered to them by a doctor? And the reason I ask this question is that a lot of drugs now that are medicines are made by the same genetically modified technologies. So for example, if you're a diabetic and you take insulin, that's now made by GM, genetically modified techniques. And the reason they do that is because the old way of extracting it actually could lead to potentially viral infections in the supply chain of the insulin. So now it's produced by bacteria. It's totally safe. It's the same technology that we're talking about using for food. So would they not take their drugs? And a lot of them are now genetically modified, and that's how they're produced.
So Kamala is looking at the Johnson-Butchick pro-GM wing with a certain amount of suspicion because she's got Gwyneth Paltrow on the line, who thinks that this whole thing about genetically modified hemp is just outrageous, and that Kim and Tony are in the pockets of Big Pharma and Big Hemp. Gwyneth thinks that instead of hemp, we should be eating seaweed, which is natural and won't require Franken genetic modification, and just grows by the bucket load on the shoreline. And thinks that if we can all be eating far more seaweed, like for example, the sheep that live in the Orkney Islands that have evolved to eat seaweed, Google it, it's true, that is the way forward. So on the one hand, we've got people who are anti-GM and want to go for natural harvesting. On the other hand, we've got people who are GM because they feel that that's sustainable and better. Now, this doesn't get to the heart of the question. You, as the audience, as the focus group that are currently feeding results to the United States president, would you eat seaweed as a main meal? Would you sit down to it instead of it being like a garnish on the top of your genetically modified hemp? Would you sit down to it and eat it as a meal? Now, so the answers are yes, of course, not unless I was desperate for food, or not unless I was a fish. I would like to become a fish to be able to have that option, quite frankly, but I keep fish at home. So does that make me a furry? I'm not sure. Scaly? I'm not sure what the term is. Okay, so we've got 80% of people are voting, and it's absolutely neck and neck between people who would do it without thinking about it and people who would only do it if they were starving. That is absolutely fascinating. Now, open your box and you should be able to find some seaweed in there. It's a seaweed snack. Take it and eat it. Can we share the results of this poll? Because someone's just, are we sharing the results now? Yes, I think we are. Okay, so you can all see that poll. Take out your snack, have an eat of it, and I'd like you to turn to the person that you're sitting next to, and if you're not sitting next to them, just turn to yourself and ask them, has your mind changed as a result of actually eating the snack? And we might come back to that during question time. So reach out and touch someone in a consensual and virtual sense and find out whether or not, once you've actually got the seaweed under your belt, whether it changes your mind. But on with the hypothetical. Susan, tell us about seaweed. Is seaweed actually a superfood? Is Gwyneth onto something here?
So I'm not sure that I would call it a superfood, but it's definitely a really nutritious food. So it's low in kilojoules, it's low in fats, it's really high in iodine, which is fantastic to help us with our functioning of our metabolism. And one of the many benefits of seaweed is that you only actually need a small amount of it in order to get those the iodine requirements. However, on the flip side, it does have the potential to accumulate heavy metals. So if you were to consume too much, there's the potential that you're also consuming things like high levels of lead and mercury can be in it, but you wouldn't actually consume it in such great quantities that that would actually be a health concern. So for example, the samples you've got in your taste box today are only 2 grams, and that's typically what you would have in a day at the most, and that's around 23% of your daily requirement of iodine. So it's a fantastic snack food to have, or you could have it in a salad or something like that.
Excellent. So Troy is concerned about sustainability because he wants to be able to sustain his lifestyle, and he gets Kim Johnson on the phone again and wants to find out, okay, if we start growing tons and tons and tons of this seaweed stuff like Gwyneth wants me to, so that we don't have to eat so much hemp, is it going to destroy the environment?
Well, the great thing about seaweed is it doesn't use any of our land, and we know that our land is really limited. And that's become a huge issue because there's a lot of problems with degrading soils and degrading land and not maintaining the biodiversity on our land. Seaweed doesn't have that issue. We are in the sea where there's a lot of water. We're surrounded by water, and that's one of our amazing features. It also doesn't need fresh water. So we're not using up fresh water, we're using seawater. The other thing is because they're algae, they're similar to plants, they take up carbon. So they actually reduce the carbon emissions. They have no carbon emissions. They reduce the carbon in the atmosphere by taking it up and growing with it. And they can also live off some waste nutrients. So the seaweeds are incredibly sustainable. In some situations as well, so in Tasmania, for example, there's this invasive or a weed, seaweed, that is not very good for the environment where that is, and the removal of that is beneficial for the native seaweeds. And then you can eat it. So we can remove it, improve the environment there in that marine environment. And this is called wakame. It's a really commonly eaten seaweed in Japan. They eat it daily as part of their diet. So in Australia, we have a lot of coast, we have a lot of water, and really at the moment there's not a lot of farming of seaweed, but there is some potential to increase that and have a sustainable agriculture that is around seaweed.
Troy is starting to see all of the pieces come together, and he's starting to see that it's not one miracle solution, but actually there's a balance of different solutions. But as he's congratulating himself on this balanced project, he gets a call that the citizens of Kentucky, after having been fed freedom burgers made out of chickpeas and hemp and seaweed for a month or so, although it all tastes great, people are starting to get tired and they're losing their interest and sort of their will to live. It turns out that after some blood tests are done, they are deficient in vitamin B12. And the doctors who do the tests tell Troy that he can only get vitamin B12 from meat. Instantly, Troy decides that we need to start growing some more meat. and is about to order that the forests in the center of the United States get cut down to be converted to pasture. However, before he does that, President Harris says, stop. We're going to lose those states in an election. We can't just do that. The environment matters. We need to find some alternative, and we need to find it fast. We need a person who knows how to make difficult decisions and isn't afraid to call it how it is. And Kamala actually calls up Martin Steinbauer, who is a senior researcher in the Department of Ecology, Environment and Evolution at La Trobe University. He also happens to be an insect specialist. Martin, what do you tell President Harris about this corner that she's got herself into?
Don't go logging native ecosystems to produce cows. We've already done enough of that. Planet Earth is sweltering under massive emissions of CO2, methane. We've got to think a bit more cleverly than conventional boring agriculture. Perhaps think about growing insects if you want protein, and do it intensively.
So Troy immediately jumps onto a chair and screams, you mean insects? I don't want cockroaches anywhere. And Kamala kind of slaps him and says, all right, Associate Professor Steinbauer, tell us more about insects. Can we feed insects to the cattle?
We've been doing, well, I say we, us Australians, as usual, pretty backwards when it comes to agriculture. The Europeans, some of the North Americans have been doing that for a while. They grow lots of insects. Feed conversion is very good in insects. Takes about 1.7 kilograms of grain to grow 1 kilogram of insect protein. That's largely because insects are cold-blooded. They don't waste lots of that energy producing heat or methane, etc. So much higher conversion efficiency of feed, also much less water use. So about 3 liters of water for 1 kilogram of insect compared to 60 liters of water for 1 kilogram of beef. So the economics and the environmental economics simply do not favor us continuing to do more of the same old, same old.
So the president's pollsters are starting to have nightmare visions of breeding cockroaches and trying to work out how it's going to be sold to the public. Martin, are we talking about cockroaches here?
Cockroaches would be rather unpleasant to eat. It's possible you could eat some of the species of their relatives, the termites, but we've grown 4 or 5 species. Well, I say we again. People in North America have been growing house crickets, Indian mealworms, and black soldier fly larvae for protein for poultry and pigs and cattle for decades. So out of the possible estimated 6 million species of insects on the planet, there's a lucky 4 who've won the lottery to be linked to the very important success of humanity, and come along as our friends with us to keep us alive in ever-growing numbers. So I've got off track there. I've forgotten what you were asking, but
well, we're asking about what the species of flies and various animals would be. The idea comes to the president that instead of feeding this stuff like black soldier fly to beef cattle and then having the methane emissions associated with that, could people eat it directly? Martin, can people actually eat insects? Is it safe?
Totally. We, Homo sapiens sapiens, has been doing it probably since we became a subspecies of sapiens. We've certainly been, Homo has been doing it ever since Homo has been around. So it's only since we perhaps moved into Europe, became refined and cultured, that we look down our noses on it as a food perhaps for the poor and the lesser people. So heaps of countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, China, they still eat lots and lots of invertebrates. So yeah, it's only us who are little preciouses.
So the presidential team is slightly shocked to find out that they are not at the edge of all technology. they decide that before they spring this in the American public, they want to spring it on their Australian focus that is group that has helped them so far. And that's you out there. So here's a poll. Would you eat an insect? Oh, it's neck and neck. Full disclosure, I was making bolognese sauce last night and I ended up putting some insects on it because it needed some sort of salt and I didn't have Parmesan. And I did not regret that decision at all, actually, much to my surprise and my son's slight disgust. Oh, neck and neck. Okay. So to within, I think, experimental error, it's 50-50 about people would or wouldn't eat an insect. Well, now's your chance. So what I'd like you to do is go to the box, and some of you have got tortilla chips made out of crickets and some other bits and pieces. Some of you have got a packet of whole insects, and they're the ones that I was putting on my sauce last night. And they're different flavors. There's some chili ones and some lime ones and some saltbush ones. If you're one of the groups that's got a teacher, this is your teacher's job. They've got to take one for the team. I would love you to take a photo of your teacher eating the insects, and we're going to check. We'll ask your principal why the teacher didn't eat the insect. Post it on the socials. Make a TikTok out of it. If you look very carefully, there's a TikTok out there of myself and Kim and Susan eating insects when we were packing the boxes at one point. So we would totally love for you guys to put something out on the socials about your teacher in particular, or just you eating an insect. Make it gross if you want. You could get a face mask and fill it with insects like we did and then just put the face mask on top of you. Or you could just dangle it over people's mouths. So looking forward to seeing those photos when they come in. Now, President Harris is very, very concerned about the California vote. This will make or break her re-election. And she's aware that there's a very powerful and thoughtful ethical eating lobby based in California, but all over the world, that wants to consider whether or not it is ethical to end a life to sustain ours. And the insect thing has got her troubled. She gets what Martin says, that we've been eating insects as a species for a really long time, and she can see the attraction of insects rather than beef. But is it right? Is it right to kill something to eat it? This might be an opportunity for us to move away from that practice. So once again, she calls on her network and gets Matthew Ruby, who is not only a psychologist who specializes in the ethics of eating, but also a vegan based in Albury Wodonga, and asks, Matt, is it right to kill an insect to eat it? Because we're not talking like one insect. We're talking about many, many, many lives. Is that even worse?
Yeah, so that's very much a hot debate at the moment. So we've done a fair bit of research on this, and we find that most people who eat other animals aren't particularly concerned about the idea of killing insects. But among those who don't eat animals or limit their intake of meat, that they're really divided. Some of them are not concerned. They say it's an insect, it can't really suffer that much, whereas others, we really don't know. We don't know to what extent insects suffer. If insects aren't really suffering in the process of being raised and killed, then a shift from conventional animals to insects would greatly reduce the amount of suffering we're causing in the world. But if they are somehow suffering in the process, it takes so many thousands of insects, or probably tens of thousands, to make as much food as one cow. So potentially we could be making the suffering problem worse, even though we'd have really good gains in terms of environmental impacts.
So this leads us to the most profound question: is it possible to farm insects in a way that does not actually make the insects suffer?
So from what we currently know, we think so. So some species of insects like black soldier fly larvae, they're really quite convenient in that after they hatch, they spend a bunch of time just eating, and you can feed them on literally any old crap. They're really good at cleaning up food waste of all types and waste of most types safely. And then after they've stuffed themselves to their content, they basically go into a sort of a coma. They go into something called torpor, where they're unconscious for a while as they prepare to go to the next stage of their life. And that's typically the point at which they're killed. So as far as we know, they're unconscious then. They don't actually feel anything. So, and theoretically, they don't suffer. Similarly, for other species of insects like crickets or grasshoppers, they're often killed by slowly cooling them. So like when they're in cold weather, they eventually go unconscious in the cold. Theoretically, that's not painful. Then if you keep going, they just don't wake up. So again, you're still killing them, but as far as we know, they're probably not suffering in the process, which is very different than how we kill mammals presently, or birds.
So President Harris sees an opportunity here. She gets her best karma economists to run the karma spreadsheets and make sure that the karma equation comes out positively, and it does. And so now the next thing is to find the audience response to a very specific question, which is, would you eat insects 1 day a week? Instead of a meat-free Monday, would you have a spider Sunday as a meat replacement, having heard what you've just heard? It looks like the attitudes are hardening against eating insects, which is very interesting. And I can only assume that's partly because of the ethical implications of ending a life. So President Harris goes back to her karma engineers and says, we need to really, really consider the benefits of doing this, because there's a downside here, and I'm worried about losing California. But presidents need to be strong, and decides that we are in fact going to farm 20 species of highly nutritious insects based on the recommendations of Martin Steinbauer. So Martin is set up in northern Queensland with similar funding to Marissa Collins. So you've got the Institute for Pulses, and we've got the Institute for Critters. And the Critter Institute has been asked to farm this for the entire world. Martin, how would you go about, as head of the Critter Institute, how are you going to ship insects to be eaten by the world's population?
Well, I was getting all excited there for a moment. I thought you might have been talking about some of our native insects to farm, but we'll stick with the standard boring black soldier fly larvae, Indian mealworm, etc., etc. Grow them up to the life cycle stage where you can put them to sleep at low temperatures, then freeze dry them, pack them in bags and send them off in huge quantities, but not very much weight, so they don't cost too much to ship around. We're not pouring out tons of CO2 to move food all around the world as we do now. But I'd be probably going around as this roving consultant telling people how to do it in situ rather than pumping CO2 out into the air. So I think that'd be the much cleverer way to go. We should feed ourselves, not feed everyone else. So that's a bad model.
The point is well made that Indigenous Australians have been eating insects for many thousands of years, and there are biosecurity issues to all of a sudden bringing in other species of insects to farm. So is it possible to use native insects here?
Yeah, we've got, so just jumping a little bit to what you were saying, David, the species we already grow in Australia, what we call cosmopolitan, that doesn't mean they like living in downtown Melbourne and having lattes for coffee. They occur all around the world. Everyone can grow them. They occur everywhere. We do have, everyone's familiar with witchetty grubs. So there are about 3 families of moth that produce very large larvae that the Aboriginals have eaten for a long time. Our family is a taxonomic thing. I don't say we eat their mums and their dads and their offspring. So there's about 3 families of moths that we could try and rear up. There's at least 1 family of beetle we could rear up in large numbers. And on that spider thing, Spider Sunday, you could offend stacks of Southeast Asians who go around hunting tarantulas as a delicacy. So we ought to be a little bit mindful of how we dissuade other people's culinary norms and try and impose our own on other people. So your yuck is somebody else's delicious.
So Matthew Ruby said something that caught President Harris's attention about bugs eating anything. When you farm insects, you can feed them almost anything. And she turns to Troy and says, does this mean that locusts will eat poo? Martin, will locusts eat poo?
No, locusts are true herbivores, just like a cow. They like to eat green vegetation. I'm not aware of a single species of Orthoptera that will go around and eat poo. There are species of longhorn grasshoppers related to crickets who will prey upon each other when their protein needs are not being met and they're marching. So if their friend in front of them feels a little bit poorly and slows down, the one behind him will eat him. So there's lots of cannibalism within insects, but no coprophagy, just not a sort. Dung beetles like coprophagy, but not Orthoptera. So that's a nonsense.
So that is clarified. Plans for processing sewage using insects is put on hold. And insects, as it turns out, after some very, very careful charismatic media appearances by Associate Professor Steinbauer, people change their minds and start to eat insects by the dozen. People are looking to Australia for leadership and looking to scientists for ways that they can create unusual recipes, unusual combinations. And so we find that the Pulse Institute and the Critter Institute become larger, more successful, and solve many of the world's dietary problems. In the process, creating new income streams for Australia so that we don't have to cut down our forests for wood chips and we don't have to dig up our land for iron ore, because agriculture is an enormous business. Australia is at the forefront and suddenly everybody wants Aussie bugs and the world's hunger problems are solved. Thank you very much for playing this game with us. Going to stop here on that positive note, thank our panelists and hand over to the project lead, Dr. Kim Johnson.
Thank you, David. Well, I can see really fantastic questions in the Q&A, so please stick around because we're going to answer as many of those questions as we can. But what I really want to get across here is that hopefully you've seen there's no one simple answer. We have huge numbers of challenges to feed a population in the future, including the lack of land, the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change, and water availability, as we all know. But you know, we have been a really inventive nation, and what we're really calling on is people like yourself to come up with really novel solutions of how we can make a better future. And you can see that we, by bringing people together, so research scientists such as ourselves, we can come up with lots of great solutions to some of these challenges. And from, you know, I hope you've heard what we have to say in that we can eat a wide variety of foods, and that's what we need to do to get our nutritional requirements, and that's a really good way of improving our health. But yeah, we really want you to come and join us as scientists and come up with solutions to challenges we probably even haven't faced yet. So in 2050, when there's 10 billion people, we're going to have a whole new set of challenges, and we want you to help us solve them.
Thank you so much, Kim. I think we're ready to go and answer some questions now, aren't we? Okie dokie. We have got so many awesome questions. I would like to start with one for Susan McLeod, who may need to throw to someone else as well. This is about allergies and insects. So if you look carefully on the packaging of insects, it sometimes says that people with seafood allergies shouldn't be eating insects. What's going on there?
So insects are like lobsters, if you like. So they have an exoskeleton, and they're just the land version. So they have the same proteins, and it's those proteins that are causing that allergic reaction. So for people who have seafood allergies, then it's very likely that they will also have allergies to insects.
Thank you very much, Susan.
I should say specifically crickets, not necessarily all insects.
Thanks for that clarification. Kim, I think this is one for you. Why don't we just cut to the chase and genetically manufacture food in a vat of nutrients? Why are you even bothering with this whole agriculture thing?
It's not easy to do. So something I didn't get a chance to say earlier was hemp, for example, is not a species you can genetically modify easily. And it's going to take a huge amount of effort just to be able to genetically transform a species like that. So not all plant species are genetically transformable. And yeah, you could just produce algae possibly in a vat that has all the nutrients we need, but that's not much fun, is it? We like to eat food, and we like to eat a whole range of food. And, you know, agriculture is important. It's really important for our economy. And, you know, we need to use everything we can, essentially, to produce food.
As a physicist, I'm actually going to break character here and say that plants are amazing solar energy harvesters. Just the energy budgets of these situations are huge. Tony's just unmuted himself.
And plants do produce the oxygen that we need to breathe. So we do have to have plants. Otherwise, they harvest CO2 as well. So they assist in that carbon balance as well. So they're very important that we have plants for life.
These are very good reasons why we won't be growing everything in a vat just soon. Monica, I think this is one for you, but you can throw to someone else if you need help. Is hemp flour also a complete protein, or do you lose that completeness when you grind the hemp seed?
Yeah, I don't know what the profile is of the hull versus the heart. So the heart is the inner part of the grain. Susan might know that a little bit more than I do, but yeah, Susan, do you know whether the heart has the same essential amino acid profile as the outer hull?
No, I don't know. I haven't looked at that. But I believe that when they make the flour, they're using the whole heart. And currently the information that we have on nutrients is based on the seed, so which is the same thing as the heart. So I would guess, and it's just a guess, that it is the same profile.
Yeah, look, I can comment on that. They can't mill hemp seed because it's way too small to do any traditional milling with. So you use the entire seed when you make the flour or something like that. So a lot of seeds are not amenable to milling by the techniques, and so they're ground whole.
That's very interesting, and you might argue that's because we haven't developed a way to mill it yet. If everyone starts eating hemp seed, we may find that the people find ways to process it. There's another processing question here, which I'm going to throw to Marissa, but again, you may need to phone a friend here. And I will just point out, this is exactly how scientists work. You answer what you can, you identify what you don't know, you bring in your colleagues to solve it as part of a team. Marissa, do legumes lose nutrient value when they're processed into pastas and crisps and whatever? Like, is it better to eat them whole from a can, or grow them or soak them at home? Or is it, if you're eating legume pasta, do you get just the same good stuff?
It's similar to the I guess the things that Monica talked about before. Anytime we process food, you potentially lose nutrients as part of the processing functions. So while eating, for example, pulse or legume-based snacks are probably a good alternative for an occasional snack, eating whole legumes and soaking them or eating them out of a can in curries and salads and roasting them or generally or eating them fresh is generally a better way to get a much fuller nutrient profile. And I'll probably hand over to Susan if she wants to add some more to that.
Yeah, so I completely agree with what Marissa's just said. So whether you're having them dried and then soaked, or whether you're having them dried and cooking them straight away or canned, all of those options are excellent options to get the nutrients that you want.
Excellent. So it sounds like there's a consistent theme here that the less you process it, the better it is for you. So moving over to seaweed, Kim, I'm going to ask you this question. Someone wants to know, can you eat any of the seaweed that you find just on the beach? Or there's some forms of seaweed that are going to kill you and some sorts that don't?
So as far as I know, there's no toxic seaweeds, but as Susan pointed out, if you eat just way too much seaweed, then you could have a problem with eating too much iodine, because they are a rich source of iodine, but if you ate just way too much of it, then you could have problems with having an overdose of iodine. But you can just pick up and eat a seaweed that you find off the coast.
But I agree, that's right, Kim, but I wouldn't do it if there's a toxic bloom of algae there, because the microalgae, which sometimes you'll see as coloured, are full of toxins, and this is sometimes how our fish get infected, because of these microalgae. So if you've got a bloom of microalgae, a colourful bloom out in the bay, I wouldn't advise foraging for the seaweed in that particular case.
Yes, I'd always be a little bit circumspect about foraging in general, actually, unless you sort of know what you're doing. Don't try this at home, kids. So over to some insect stuff. Martin, time to shine. Is there stuff that you might get poisoned by that the insects have eaten? I phrased that badly, but you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. So we have lots and lots of species that are called aposematically coloured, usually orange, black, yellow, black, red, black. They'd be full of nasties. You would have to eat probably a lot of them to, you know, be poisoned or intoxicated by them, but it'd be pretty unpleasant. And then there's others, you know, like the Clistemon sawfly that was out in my garden a few months ago. You ate that, you'd be basically eating essential oils from the Clistemon. It'd be pretty unpleasant as well. So that's probably why we have this small suite of insects that we know are reasonably palatable and we know their nutritional value from. So we'd have to identify new species and work out, you know, what they sequester, what they don't. So they're sequestering plant toxins a lot of the time and partially converting them. And most of us mammals don't like eating plant toxins.
So there's, to follow up on that, with an insect that we have been harvesting from the wild, do we need to feed them some special food just before we humanely end their existence?
So it becomes like any agricultural system. There are preferred diets that will reduce how much unpleasant compounds they'll sequester. So snails, for example, when you're rearing up snails, you should let them void all their stomach contents for about 3 days before you eat them. It's a bit like pulling the heart or the cord out of a prawn. You shouldn't really go eating that. It's full of all sorts of goop that they've eaten. So we do have to do processing with them, but I eat my prawns shell and all. I would eat.
What?
Yeah, what's the problem? It's a good bit of roughage. I don't care. I can't be bothered fiddling around. And as for cricket or whatever, yep, that'd go in whole. Just a nice bit of crunch. It's very boring to just have boring texture in your mouth, isn't it? You need a bit of variety.
So this actually legitimately is a follow-up question, which is about whether you eat the whole of the insect. But I want to know, do you take like a prawn that you've cooked and just eat the head?
I eat up until the carapace, just whole, just stick it in my mouth.
What's the carapace? I'm a physicist.
Well, that's the part that all the legs attached to and the eyes attached to the antennae.
So you're not eating.
They usually break them and people pull the tail apart and then pull out the cord, etc., etc. But I'll just eat up to the carapace. And yeah.
But you won't eat the bit with the eyes.
No, there's a barb runs along the top of most species that is pretty unpleasant. I have done it as a joke. It's a bit crunchy.
You must have amazing parties. So this follow-up question to that from the audience is, so with insects in general, does one eat the entire insect?
Yep. So a good one for people to look up. They could go and look up for themselves. One of the treats in Central Africa, places like Uganda, etc. A longhorn grasshopper called nzenene, N-S-E-N-E-N-E, nzenene. It's a delicacy. They catch it live. I'm not sure how they kill them, but they just basically lightly roast them and then eat them straight away. So when we kill most insects, it is as Matt says, because they're poikilotherms, they're cold-blooded, we put them slowly to sleep at low temperature, or you can anesthetize them with CO2 That's another way of putting them to sleep and then dispatching of them.
Thank you, Martin. We'll move away from the insect death theme just for a minute. There's been a great question that gets at the heart of this entire project, and I'm not quite sure who I'll throw it to, but the question was, instead of looking at the nutritional benefits of all of these less common crops, you know, the legumes, the insects, the seaweed, the hemp, should we be considering the energy efficiency of the process? Is there a downside to these crops, like, for example, hemp and legumes, that conventional grains give you an advantage? Maybe I'll throw to the lead, Kim, because you've thought about this global issue a lot. What is there a counter argument against what we're subtly advocating here?
Well, a lot of the alternative foods sources we've chosen are because of their sustainability, and their potential sustainability, I think, as well, is important, because things like wheat, they've been you know, bred for many, many generations to be highly efficient. They are an extremely efficient crop. So they're not bad in that respect. But the potential for other crops, and maybe Marissa can speak to this as well, so legumes have just not had as much attention. So there is so much potential to improve them and improve their productivity, and therefore their efficiency, and therefore we can produce more on the same amount of land or less land than we do now, and therefore allow other aspects of biodiversity to thrive, because we really can't take up any more land. We don't have any more land to take up, and we have limited water. So there's efficiencies that we can make in terms of some of these other crops, and having a diverse range of crops and animals is also important, because I think there was a question about monocultures, and you don't want monocultures because they're really susceptible to things like disease, and disease is can be a huge issue, and we've seen that this year. You know, coronavirus affects humans, but it also affects animals, and you know, plants and animals that we eat can get diseases as well. So we need a diversity. We can't just, there's of course no one single answer. We need a range of options.
So Marissa, maybe I'll throw to you via Kim there, and there's to dig for a moment into this issue of efficiency. So as a physicist, I think of efficiency as being the amount of useful work you get out for the energy that you put in. So I think about it in terms of the energy, like the amount of heat required to make fertilizers, and the amount of farming machinery you've got to build, and that sort of thing. But I know that that's not the only definition of efficiency. So could you maybe, I'm putting you on the spot here, could you explain a little bit what we mean by efficiency in farming and yields in farming?
So when we think about this in a farming context, we think about some of the things you've just mentioned. So every crop that we harvest has grain that leaves your property, but in that grain is the nutrients that we've spent quite a lot of time today talking about. But it means that we're mining those nutrients out of the soil, and we need to have an active process of fertilization, so we put inputs back into the soil, and that all of those inputs add up over time, and they contribute to the efficiencies. One of the things, like pulse crops have been grown in rotation with cereal crops for thousands of years, and rotations, including pulse crops, have been really common for a really long time because they are quite efficient. So they use the same equipment that the wheat does and the barley does. They're harvested in a very similar fashion. And so from that perspective, they have relatively high efficiencies. Where we're, I guess, limited and there's less efficiency is that they're quite vulnerable to stress, particularly abiotic, so heat or water stress or frost, in comparison to wheat. But a lot of those vulnerabilities are present because we haven't spent the last 100 years breeding pulse crops so that they're maximising their efficiency. That's the future for us. And then there's plenty of research in Australia, but also globally, that's focusing on those sorts of things. When we think about alternative crops, so for example, if I use hemp as an example, you know, we really have to think about how much water does it need, does it need irrigation? What fertilisation requirements it has? Can I produce it on scale? Do I have the right sorts of equipment to plant it and then harvest it? So all of those sorts of factors become key questions when we think about efficiencies in terms of farming.
Thank you, Marissa. That's a fantastic answer. Tony, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out it depends on how you define efficiency. I think another aspect of the challenge between diversity and the current crops is that water use efficiency is a big issue. And, you know, we've been breeding a lot of these crops to try and minimize the use of water. Agriculture is a massive, the biggest user of water on the planet. And so when you think about going into other crops, you do need to think about their water use efficiency. The other side of the supply chain that I'd like to talk about, and I think this is why the move towards using whole grains or less processing, is that alongside the development of these major crops that we've bred for 10,000 years has been a food chain, food processing sort of chain that makes thousands of different products from that particular crop. So if you're going to talk about energy efficiency, if you're going to bring a new crop in to feed people, you need to think about that manufacturing and food supply chain. Of course, you can bypass all that if you eat whole grains, and that will stop that, but that's not how we've actually developed our food supply chains, and so we have to rethink that.
Yes, thank you very much, Tony. I was going to throw to Matt here, but I think he might have had to run because we're almost out of time. So maybe I'll throw to Susan for this, which is why historically have human beings liked to process their food? I know we touched on this during the hypothetical, but it's not as though this is just a wickedness that we do because we're stupid. Has the game changed a little bit? And in particular, is there a tension between how we live in the wealthy OECD countries and how the rest of the several billion of the world's population lives? I know that's a very open-ended question, but I think you can see where I'm trying to go with it. It captures a few of the questions that have been queuing up.
It's an excellent question. So there's a number of reasons why we process our foods. One of the reasons is that it's a fantastic way of keeping our foods available for longer. So that's one thing. It's around preservation techniques. Another thing is it makes it more easily able to be digested. So for example, or used in different ways. So we've talked a little bit about wheat today and the fact that we mill wheat and we remove the husk. And while that does remove some of the nutrients, it also means that we have more versatility for what we can do with that with the hulled wheat grain. So just like I think Monica was talking, or Marissa was talking about before, the polishing of the rice, it allows us to keep it longer so that the bacteria doesn't deteriorate it. There's a whole range of reasons. So makes it more editable, and also preservation would be the key factors around that.
Yeah, because I believe that 30%, is it, Tony, of the agricultural produce is lost between the field and the plate, Kim?
Yeah, so that's correct, and it varies depending on which countries you're in. So in the developing world, about 30% of the crop is lost between harvest and transport to the distribution outlets, whereas in the developed world, the 30% is lost basically post-harvest, where in food processing, we just throw food away. We waste a lot of food. So that's a big challenge. If we could increase today if we change those. So if we had, for example, if in the developing world they had refrigerated transport available to them, then they wouldn't waste so much of their produce. In the current environment, we've got to think, although now coronavirus hasn't helped us, but you know, we do throw a lot of food away because of a lot of health aspects and safety, and it's a balance as to what you do there. But we don't tend to, you know, restaurants used to once give you a bag to take your food away with. They moved away from that where you could actually do it. Today, you probably can't do that. You take it away in plastic products. And so, you know, we've now got another problem there. So.
Thanks, Tony. I'd like to maybe make the last voice to be the first voice, which is the project lead, Kim Johnson. Kim, some of the people in the chat have pointed out that school is now sort of over. But we still got 79 people on tap, which is absolutely fantastic. Absolutely thanks to everybody for coming on today. We had a very, very big response. Kim, would you like to maybe make a final comment before we wrap it up?
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along to listen to this conversation today. And you can see that it's complex, it's challenging. You know, there's so many different aspects we haven't touched on today or barely touched on today, like waste, like transport. There's a lot of other things that come into play in terms of trying to make sustainable agriculture as well as nutritious food. So keep up the conversation. We really want to keep engaging with you. We want you to come on our website. We've got lots of resources, and just contact us. There's plenty more conversations to be had.
And I've just remembered there's a QR code on your placemat. Get onto the socials, make us feel loved. Make sure that you remember that all of us in these squares are employees of you and the taxpayer. And you can find our email addresses very easily. You can send us emails. We'd actually quite like to hear from you. So don't think that just because you're not a university student that you can't send us an email if you've got a question. Isn't that right, guys? Yep, nodding heads, good to see. People often forget that we're actually quite happy to have emails from people who are school students, because you're the future, you really are. And usually the questions are very good too. I'd also like to put a shout out to Jess and Lena, who are the two people that you can't see. They've been our tech support today and have been helping us triage the questions and run everything so that we've got our brains free to talk. Yeah, absolutely, props. I'd like to thank all the speakers once again, and to wish everyone else look after yourself, look after your loved ones, and thank you for joining us for Taste Tonight.